What I think I've been asked to do is to provide you with a little bit of context, kind of a way to think about this issue, both in terms of the morning's discussion and also in terms of San Francisco. So I'm going to make 4 or 5 points. The first point I want to make is to think about a way to tell you how I think about these issues. Both this issue, but in general issues around labor standards and how to improve working standards. What's our goal? Our goal is not, and I think it's very important to be clear about it, our goal is not to minimize costs to employers, right? If our goal was to minimize costs to employers, we'd have child labor. But we don't have child labor, and no employer in this room, and I'm sure no employer around, in New York supports child labor. But why don't we have child labor, right? We don't have it because we weigh the costs and benefits of any set of policies. Now, providing employers with a cost structure that enables them to create jobs is a big benefit. We want to have employers create jobs, and we're grateful when they do that, but there are also costs. So, for example, just to take the case of child labor, the costs are both to the kids and to the society over long periods of time for kids who are either injured or sick from child labor or don't get an adequate education. So I think we have to weigh costs and benefits. And so I wouldn't want to get into a debate that said if there's some employer out there who can't hire an additional person or even who goes out of business because of some policy, that means that that policy should not be passed. We're weighing costs and benefits. Now, there are certain policies in which the costs are much higher than the benefits. And you can imagine, and I'll describe, for example, a range of regulatory policies that would be a bad idea. But in principle, that's what we're doing. The second thing I would say, in response in part to some of the discussion that we had this morning, is in thinking about a policy, you want to look at a range of evidence. So studies, academic studies, are certainly one piece of evidence. We also want to look at history, and history is important. We can look at accounting data. What's the cost structure of firms? But I think we also have learned recently that accounting data is not always what it appears to be. And we can use anecdotes. I know this company who has this experience. I know, let me bring in this worker, let me bring in that worker. So in the end of the day, we add up different kinds of evidence and arrive at a reasonable conclusion. And that's, I think, how we should be doing this, not by focusing on any one kind or any one piece of evidence. Now, what's the larger context in which this discussion is taking place? The larger context is inequality. There is a tremendous amount of inequality in this country along wage dimensions. You all know that. But what's important to understand is that the discussion in the last 6 months or so, partly due to Occupy, partly due to what President Obama is putting on the national agenda, partly due to the urgency of the issue itself, there's a great deal of interest in inequality and how to think about it and what to do about it. Right? Now, a lot of this discussion is about national policy. What should be the tax structure? How do we address those kinds of issues? But inequality also has to be addressed in terms of job quality, because one of the main sources of inequality is the nature of people's jobs. And inequality also has to be addressed in terms of mobility issues, people's capacity who are at the bottom of the labor market to climb a ladder and to move up. And I view paid sick leave as important in terms of job quality, which connects to the larger inequality discussion. But even more concretely, it relates to issues around people's mobility, right? Because the way you move up in this world, and Mr. Schwartz described it for his own history, right? He started off at the bottom of the ladder in his company, but he stayed in that company and moved up a ladder. If he had lost his job, if he'd been fired because he was sick, and had to move to another company, if he had an unstable work history because of that set of reasons, he would not have moved up. And that's a generalization, right? The generalization is that if you can't have stable employment, if you can't stay with an employer, if you cannot accumulate human capital, you're much less likely to be upwardly economically mobile, which is a bad thing. And you also are, therefore, we're not addressing the fundamental problem that we face now of inequality. So that's, I think, the larger context in which to think about this. So what's the evidence around this? Well, one evidence are the studies that Aaron described and other people have, and John has talked about. And my view, and I read this literature very deeply and very widely, is that what you've heard is right. that these studies of basically low impacts of the minimum wage are accurately capture what the evidence tells us about the minimum wage. And when you also heard that the kind of costs associated with this particular piece of legislation are quite low relative to recent minimum wage increases, I think it's very reasonable to conclude that the impact of this on employment will be quite low based on those studies. Now, I'd say two things about that. Again, in the context of the discussion this morning, a number of people said, yes, but firms face additional costs in the top of this legislation, that regulation. But all those studies were done in the context of firms that face those costs, right? So conditional on all firms already facing those costs, the impact has been quite low from a minimum wage increase. Now, it's also true that all these minimum wage increases are done in the context of studies are done in the context of relatively small changes in the minimum wage. I would never advocate, and I don't think anyone around the table would advocate, a minimum wage of $20 an hour. Right. There's certainly an increase in the minimum wage which would be very destructive. And so the question is, we're weighing costs and benefits, we're weighing what's likely to happen here, and at the range we're talking about, the costs are minimal. Well, how about the evidence from history? Right from Triangle Shirtwave Factory on up, we have raised the standards, we've raised the floor in the labor market. And listen, the American economy may be doing poorly now, but over the long run of history, the American economy has done extremely well, right? We all know that. High rates of productivity, high rates of job creation. And despite the fact that we've constantly pushed the floor up in the labor market through a wide range of policy. So I think history supports the proposition that reasonable increases in labor market standards are beneficial, not destructive. The gains to firms, there's a substantial amount of evidence, both academic studies and anecdotal evidence, that in fact what's been said is true. The turnover goes down, that worker commitment goes up, the quality of service to employees goes up. Again, Mr. Schwartz, your employees treat your customers better because you treat them well, and in fact, the evidence does support that generalization. And so the benefits to the firms are there. And finally, this level playing field point, right? There are many, and I'm sure a majority of firms in the city that treat their employees well. But you don't want them to have to compete with firms that are cutting costs in the same product market segment by squeezing labor, because it's unfair competition. There's a general benefit to raising the floor, and the benefit accrues to firms, again, like Mr. Schwartz's firm, that treat their workers well, because he doesn't have to compete with another firm that isn't doing the same thing, and therefore has an artificially low cost structure. So when I weigh this all out, it seems to me that the case is pretty clear that this legislation, which is honestly quite mild legislation, the benefits really do outweigh the costs, and they do so by a substantial margin. And I do urge you to kind of think about this in the context of the larger debate we're having in this country about inequality and what to do about it.